No one expected deception of this scale. Yet British intelligence managed to lead Germany in circles for years, and they never even realized it. By the beginning of the war, German intelligence was confident that it controlled a network of agents in Britain. They transmitted data about industry, aviation, and troop movements. These messages were sent by radio, verified in Berlin, and became part of strategic calculations. Bombing plans were built on them, and the strength of the Royal Air Force was assessed through their reports. The problem was that none of these agents operated independently. By 1941, every spy sent into Britain had either been arrested or had surrendered voluntarily. Instead of eliminating them, MI5 proposed a different model. The agent continued to operate. He continued to send radio messages. He continued to receive instructions from Germany. The difference was that every one of his messages was written in London. To manage this system, a committee was created that became known as the 20 Committee. The two X letters signified a double game. This was not an operation to intercept individual spies, but an attempt to construct a controlled reality for the enemy. The Germans were not meant simply to receive false data. They were meant to make decisions believing those decisions came from their own intelligence. Messages were transmitted according to a strict schedule. The characteristic mistakes of specific radio operators were preserved. Sometimes the information was accurate in order to maintain trust. Sometimes it arrived late in order to appear realistic. In Berlin, they saw familiar patterns, recognized their agents, and did not suspect that the network no longer belonged to them. By this point, Germany was no longer receiving information from Britain. It was receiving a reflection of a war that had been constructed for it by British analysts, and it was on the basis of that reflection that decisions were made, the consequences of which would only become visible years later. In classical intelligence work, an agent is a source of information. In the double-cross system, the agent became an instrument for transmitting a pre-designed reality. The 20 Committee did not function as an operational unit, but as an analytical center that calculated the reaction of the German command to every message. Each captured spy received a new role. His past, habits, and radio style were preserved. The Germans knew the transmission speed of a specific operator, the pattern of his mistakes, and even the time when he usually went on the air. Any change caused suspicion. Therefore, the deception was built from exact copies of behavior. Messages were written to appear as if they had been obtained at risk. An agent could complain about a lack of money, request additional batteries for the transmitter, or report difficulties with observation. The Abwehr saw in this the signs of real work and increased funding. The money arrived in Britain and was recorded by MI5 as part of the operation. At times, completely accurate data was sent to Berlin, but only information that had already lost its value. For example, reports about the movement of air units after their redeployment. This created a confirmation effect. German analysts recorded the coincidences and concluded that the network was highly reliable. The main element was timing. If a convoy left port at night, the report about it arrived in the morning. Formally, the agent was telling the truth. In practice, the information was useless. The Germans believed they were receiving operational data and did not realize that their decisions were based on events that had already taken place. By 1942, the system reached full closure. New agents were almost never sent because the existing network was considered sufficient. This meant that Germany no longer had independent sources in Britain. All information passed through the filter of the 20 Committee. At this point, counterintelligence turned into an instrument of strategic management. The British could strengthen or weaken specific threats in the German perception simply by changing the volume and character of messages. If it was necessary to create the impression of troop concentration, agents began to report more frequently about movements of equipment. If it was necessary to reduce anxiety, the flow of information was reduced. The central figure of the system was the agent Garbo. He did not simply transmit messages, he managed a network of 27 fictitious sub-agents supposedly operating across Britain. Each of them had a biography, political views, and his own channel of communication. The Germans paid salaries to people who had never existed. For Berlin, this looked like a complex and effective intelligence network. For London, it was a single controlled transmitter. The entire German assessment of British forces industry and preparation for invasion was formed inside this construction. Thus, Germany made decisions relying not on intelligence, but on a model created by the enemy. And the more coincidences German analysts found, the more they trusted a system that no longer belonged to them. Juan Pujol Garcia was not a professional intelligence officer. He had no access to military facilities and no technical education. His value lay in something else, in his ability to understand what information the enemy wanted to hear. This is what made him the central element of the double-cross system. After establishing contact with the British, he received the code name Garbo and a task that had no equivalent. He had to create an agent network inside a country where he had never been. His reports were built from open sources, observations of newspapers, train schedules, and indirect signs of economic activity. These details were transformed into detailed reports that looked like the work of field agents. Gradually, Garbo informed Berlin that he was managing a group of sub-agents located in different regions of Britain. Each of them had a legend of his own: a dock worker, an employee of an aircraft factory, a clerk in a transport company, a soldier sympathetic to Germany. For each, a biography, a message style, and a level of access to information were defined. German intelligence accepted this construction as a real network. Funding increased, instructions were sent directly to Garbo, and his agents received assignments that he formally passed along. In reality, all correspondence was processed by MI5, where analysts distributed roles among people who did not exist. One of the key elements was the internal dynamics of the network. Some sub-agents were reported killed during bombings, others disappeared because of police suspicion, and others stopped transmitting because of illness. These losses made the system appear realistic. The Abwehr saw a natural reduction of the network and considered it confirmation of its authenticity. At times, Garbo sent urgent messages marked as highly important. They arrived with delays explained by communication difficulties or risk to the agent. The Germans interpreted this as proof that the information was obtained under threat. In reality, the delay was calculated so that the data lost operational value but retained analytical significance. By 1943, his network was considered one of the most reliable in Britain. Through it, Berlin received information about troop movements and the condition of aviation and the mood of the population. None of these messages were the result of independent intelligence work. They were a structure created in London and controlled as a single source. In this way, Germany relied on a picture assembled from dozens of observers who had never existed. And the more messages arrived from this network, the more convincing the illusion became, on which strategic conclusions were built. The Garbo network created the illusion of presence, but its real power lay in the timing of information. In the double-cross system, a message was valued not for its content, but for the moment when it reached Berlin. It was timing that turned truth into disinformation. Each radio transmission passed through several levels of verification. Analysts in MI5 determined when an event would lose operational value, but retain the appearance of relevance. Only after that was the message encoded and sent to the Germans in the name of the agent. Formally, the data matched reality. In fact, it described the past. If a convoy sailed during the night, the report about its departure could arrive in the morning with an explanation that the agent had not been able to transmit earlier. The Abwehr recorded an exact match of facts and concluded that the source was highly effective. In reality, the German command received information that could no longer influence the actions of submarines. The same method was applied to aviation. Reports about the redeployment of Royal Air Force squadrons were sent after the flights had already been completed. The Germans adjusted bombing plans according to airfields that were no longer in use. At the same time, analytical reports in Berlin confirmed the reliability of the network because the data corresponded with observed outcomes. Special attention was given to the intervals between transmissions. A real radio operator could not work on a perfect schedule. Therefore, messages were sent with irregular delays, sometimes with gaps and sometimes with long pauses, explained by the danger of operating. These pauses increased trust because they created a sense of risk. Financial requests were also used as an instrument. An agent could ask for additional funds for batteries or for the payment of sub-agents. The Germans viewed such requests as proof of active work. The money was transferred to accounts controlled by the British and became part of the operation budget. By 1943, German intelligence no longer simply accepted the messages as credible. It began to use them as the basis for long-term analysis. Timing made it possible to create trends. Repeated reports about troop concentration in certain regions produced a stable picture that influenced strategic planning. In my view, this is the point where the operation ceases to be classical disinformation. It is no longer false data, but the management of how the enemy perceives the dynamics of the war. The Germans saw not events, but their interpretation arranged according to a predetermined rhythm. As a result, Germany made decisions based on information that was both truthful and useless. This combination proved far more dangerous than direct falsehood because it could not be exposed by simple comparison of facts. After timing had proven its effectiveness, the double-cross system began to be used to form a stable perception of British aviation. The German command attempted to assess the size of the Royal Air Force, the rate of aircraft production, and the level of losses. These data directly influenced bombing plans and the distribution of Luftwaffe resources. Garbo and other controlled agents regularly transmitted information about the condition of airfields, the number of aircraft, and the intensity of training flights. At first glance, the information appeared detailed and plausible. Specific types of machines were mentioned, the approximate number of crews, and even the level of wear of the equipment. However, all of these data passed through the filter of MI5 analysts. The main task was not to underestimate or overestimate the strength of the Royal Air Force, but to create fluctuations in the assessment. Some reports spoke of a shortage of aircraft and overloaded airfields, while others described increased production and the transfer of new units. This contradictory picture forced German analysts to constantly revise their conclusions. As a result, the Luftwaffe could not develop a stable strategy. The assessment of enemy strength changed from month to month. This influenced the selection of targets and the frequency of raids. At times, strikes were directed against facilities that were considered critically important according to agent reports, but in reality no longer played a key role. An additional element was information about air defense systems. Reports about the placement of radar stations and anti-aircraft batteries were transmitted with delays or in incomplete form. The Germans planned raid routes based on outdated data, which increased losses and reduced the effectiveness of operations. By 1944, an Oberstdiener had formed in Berlin that the Royal Air Force remained a serious but limited force, experiencing difficulties in replacing losses. This belief did not correspond to reality, where aircraft production and crew training had reached peak levels. The gap between real power and its perception grew larger. It is important that this illusion was not built on crude falsehood. It was created through the selection of which facts to show and which to conceal. The Germans saw fragments of reality but could not assemble them into a complete picture. This method proved the most ustойчивый because it did not produce sharp contradictions in analytical reports. In the end, the Luftwaffe planned actions against an opponent that it imagined differently from what he actually was. And this difference gradually turned into a strategic advantage for Britain achieved without direct confrontation in the air. By the summer of 1944, the double-cross system received a new task. Germany began to use V-1 cruise missiles against London, and the accuracy of their strikes depended on the assessment of the point of impact. German intelligence had no observers of its own in Britain and was forced to rely on agent reports. These reports were again written in London. Their purpose was not to conceal the impacts completely, but to shift the perception of them. If a missile fell in the center of the city, the report sent to Berlin described an explosion on the outskirts. If a strike hit a residential district, it was described as an impact on an industrial zone of no strategic value. The Abwehr collected these data and passed them to the military, responsible for setting the range of the V-1. The Germans adjusted launch parameters in an attempt to bring the missiles closer to the stated targets. But because the original information was distorted, each new correction moved the points of impact farther away from the center of London. It was especially important to preserve plausibility. The reports included details about destruction, the number of casualties, and the work of rescue services. Some of these details corresponded to reality, which strengthened trust in the sources. The Germans saw a consistent picture of strikes and considered it the result of effective intelligence. As a result, a significant number of missiles began to fall in southern districts and beyond the city limits. This did not mean that the attacks lost their danger, but their strategic goal, the destruction of central infrastructure, was achieved far less often. The German command believed that the guidance system was functioning and continued to use the same parameters. In my view, this is where the operation reaches its highest level of maturity. It was no longer about creating a false picture of a future invasion. It was a direct influence on the effectiveness of enemy weapons through control of information about the results of their use. In practice, the trajectory of the missiles was determined not only by technical characteristics, but also by the text of radio messages. For Germany, the V-1 remained a symbol of technological retaliation. For Britain, it became another channel through which the perception of the war could be managed, and the longer the Germans relied on data from their agents, the more their own weapon lost accuracy. Thus, the double-cross system for the first time influenced not only stab decisions, but also the physical distribution of strikes across the territory of the country. It was the moment when information began to change the geography of war. By June 1944, the double-cross system had reached its main objective. The German command expected an invasion of Western Europe, but did not know the exact point of attack. For Berlin, the key source of information remained the same agents who had been working under the control of MI5 for several years. Garbo transmitted a series of messages about the concentration of troops in southeastern England. The reports spoke about the formation of large formations, the preparation of landing craft, and activity in ports oriented toward the shortest route across the English Channel. This information matched German expectations because the Pas de Calais was considered the most logical landing point. At the same time, agents reported that the observed activity in other regions was a diversion. Normandy was described as a secondary direction where limited forces were concentrated. Such assessments did not contradict German logic and were therefore perceived as confirmation of existing conclusions. After the Allied landing on the 6th of June, Garbo sent an urgent message with a delay explained by communication difficulties. It stated that the operation in Normandy was only the first stage and that the main invasion was still ahead. This message became critically important. It confirmed for Berlin the hypothesis of the main strike in the Pas de Calais. As a result, the German command kept significant forces in that area for several weeks. Armored divisions and reserves were not transferred to Normandy despite the worsening situation at the front. The decision was based on the expectation of a second larger landing that never occurred. It is important that this mistake was not the result of a single radio message. It was the outcome of years of building trust in the agent network. The Germans could not ignore data that had previously been confirmed many times. The logic of the system forced them to adhere to the original model, even when reality began to contradict it. From a military point of view, this meant a loss of time that could not be compensated. The Allies secured the bridgehead and began to build up forces, while the main German reserves remained outside the combat zone. A decision taken on the basis of information from London influenced the distribution of troops across the entire Western Front. This episode shows that the double-cross operation reached its highest point not at the moment of transmitting false data, but at the moment when the enemy continued to believe it despite obvious changes in the situation. That was the moment when the illusion became stronger than the facts. By the summer of 1944, German intelligence formally still saw Britain. Radio messages were arriving, agents were asking for money, reporting observations, and clarifying details. On paper, the network functioned perfectly. But in reality, Germany had been reading not Britain, but London for several years. The most dangerous part of this story is not that the Germans were deceived. War is full of deception. The most dangerous part is that the Germans could not admit that they had been deceived. Because such an admission would have meant only one thing: the entire Abwehr in Britain had been destroyed, and their decisions for years had been built on emptiness. After the 6th of June 1944, the contradictions became physically obvious. The landing in Normandy was expanding, the front was growing, and the Allies were increasing their forces. Yet German reserves in the Pas de Calais remained waiting for the main strike. This decision did not look irrational, it looked logical inside the model. This model had been assembled over years, not by a single radio message and not by a single agent. The Germans had become accustomed to the network providing confirmations, numbers, routes, conversations, and supposed observations in ports. And because some of the information was sometimes true, the trust became absolute. Inside the German analytical system, a simple psychological mechanism was operating. If you have invested resources, signatures, reputation, and career into a decision, you do not cancel it quickly. You look for an explanation of why it is still correct, and that is why the Pas de Calais continued to be held as a trap for an army that did not exist. MI5 understood this and applied pressure at the same point. Agents continued to observe concentrations of forces in southeastern England. They reported new units' movements of equipment and preparations for the next wave. This did not create a new illusion, it prevented the old one from collapsing. In the end, Germany did not lose divisions as much as it lost time. And time was the only resource that in 1944 could no longer be replaced. While reserves waited for a phantom invasion, the Allies were consolidating the real bridgehead, building ports, extending supply lines, and increasing aviation. At the same time, another side of the effect was unfolding. The Abwehr had effectively stopped investing in new sources in Britain because their own network already existed. After 1942, insertions were reduced not out of weakness, but out of confidence. This confidence became a trap. There was simply no alternative network. It is here that it becomes clear that double cross was not a series of elegant tricks, but the engineering of trust. Britain did not simply introduce falsehood. It built a system in which the enemy protected the illusion himself, because it supported his internal logic, his previous decisions, and his fear of admitting failure. The same principle operated with the V1. The Germans corrected strikes according to agent reports, believing them to be independent observers. In reality, the corrections were based on texts written in London. The weapon of retaliation became a weapon whose trajectory depended on paper. At a certain point, the operation ceased to be intelligence and became strategic. Britain gained not only the ability to influence enemy decisions, but also the ability to read his reactions. The return instructions of the Abwehr showed what the Germans considered a threat, where they expected a strike, and what conclusions they drew from the facts. In my view, this is the main result. War is won not only by destruction, but by managing the picture of the world inside which the enemy thinks. When you control the channels of information, you control not the messages, you control the conclusions. And that is why double-cross is more dangerous than any single act of disinformation. A single falsehood can be exposed. A system of trust is almost impossible to expose because it begins to defend itself. And when Germany finally confronted reality, it was already too late to rebuild its thinking. The war did not leave time for that. The double-cross operation did not destroy a single division and did not shoot down a single aircraft. Its result cannot be measured by maps of offensives or by the number of lost equipment. Yet it demonstrated that control over information can change decisions faster than any weapon. By the end of the war, Germany continued to believe that its intelligence in Britain had functioned effectively almost to the very end. This conclusion remained even after failures because the reporting system appeared logical and consistent. Reality did not refute it immediately, and therefore doubt could be postponed. For Britain, this became confirmation of a new model of war. Intelligence ceased to be a tool for collecting data and became a tool for shaping the thinking of the enemy. A message no longer described an event. It created the frame within which the event was interpreted. It is important that this operation was not built on crude falsehood. It was built on trust created through years of precise details, delays, mistakes, and plausible requests for money. It was the combination of truth and uselessness that made the system stable. The Germans could not simply compare facts and detect the deception because the facts formally coincided. After the war, many participants regarded double-cross as a technical success of counterintelligence, but its significance extends beyond a single conflict. For the first time, a model was implemented in which the enemy makes decisions while existing inside an information environment created by the other side. In my view, this is one of the key turning points of the 20th century. Here appears the understanding that war is fought not only for territory and resources, but for the ability to determine which picture of the world is considered real. The one who forms this picture gains an advantage before the operation even begins. Double-cross showed that a system can become blind not because of a lack of data, but because of an excess of trust in data that confirms its expectations. This is a more complex form of vulnerability because it arises inside the logic of analysis itself and is not perceived as an error. That is why the operation remains relevant. It demonstrates that modern strategy is built not only on technology and weapons, but on the management of the interpretation of information. Victory is achieved at the moment when the enemy is certain that he is acting rationally, while his initial data has already been defined by someone else. Double-cross was not just an episode of the Second World War. It was a transition to an era in which control over perception becomes part of strategic planning. And in this war, the front line runs not on the map, but inside analytical reports and stab decisions. If you find this material valuable and you do not want to miss new videos, subscribe to the Secret Front channel. There is much more ahead.